Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Amma ba'd. I couldn't come up here without my coffee because I love my coffee. And they only had Tim Hortons. And it is a substitute for coffee. But it doesn't quite do the job. And my favorite coffee is actually white chocolate mocha. You know the flavor? White chocolate mocha? I love white chocolate mocha. And when I went to Mecca a month and a half ago, I made sure I had my mocha every single day. But do you know that if I had drank a mocha in Mecca 500 years ago, I would have actually been jailed, taken in front of a judge, punished, and then whipped and lashed for the crime of drinking a mocha in Mecca. I kid you not. But before I get to the mocha in Mecca, do you know that even the word coffee, it actually comes from the Arabic, qahwa. You all know qahwa. And the English word coffee comes from the Arabic qahwa. And the Arabic qahwa, most likely it comes from a province or a land in Ethiopia called Kaffa. And it was in this area where people first roasted beans that we now call coffee beans or coffee plants. And some Yemeni traders, Yemeni, where are the Yemenis? Yemenis, represent, mashallah. Yes indeed, Yemenis, mashallah. Wallahi, I would have been proud to be a Yemeni because our Prophet ﷺ praised the people of Yemen. Al-hikmatu yamanin wal-imanu yamaniyya. Some Yemeni traders, they went to Ethiopia, and this is around the 9th Islamic century, the 13th or 12th Gregorian century. And they brought back these beans, and they called them beans from Kaffa, so qahwa, so coffee. And eventually they started growing these beans in Yemen. And it became so popular they had to export the beans to other lands. And the city of export was a very famous city, it's still a very famous export city, called Al-Mukha. And the beans from Al-Mukha and the preparation for Al-Mukha became mocha. And slowly but surely, coffee spread to other Arab lands and eventually made its way to Europe through Venice, especially Italy, and it started spreading throughout European lands. And therefore, coffee has always been associated with the Arabs, and in particular with the Yemenis in early pre-modernity, 17th, 18th, 19th century. And if you were to find any coffee bean canister or can that was sold here in America in the 19th and early 20th century, you would always find a picture of some weird dressed Arab, sometimes a scantily dressed Arab lady, you know, the veil and belly button open, you know, that type of stuff they have, you know, back in the 19th century. Coffee was associated with Arabs, and to this day, the most prized beans are called Arabica beans because it was the Arabs, it was the Muslims who made coffee basically so popular. But it wasn't always popular. It was during the 1500s when qahwa spread to Ottoman lands, and the scholars there began even debating and drinking it. Eventually it's made its way to Mecca and Medina. And it is mentioned in our books of history that on the 23rd of Rabi' al-Awwal, 917 Hijrah, corresponding to around March of 1511 CE, coffee had already spread to Mecca, and a scholar was doing tawaf around the Kaaba, and he saw a group of young men drinking something suspicious and having a good time in the corner of the Haram. And he came up to them, and they immediately shut out the lantern and they hid whatever they were drinking. So he challenged them, what is this? And they finally confessed that they were drinking qahwa. So he had them arrested and he brought them in front of a trial. A group of, I'm not making this up, some of you are looking at me as if, no, I'm not making this up, guys. This is exactly true, okay? And he brought them in front of a group of ulama, and he brought forth the Hanbalis, the Shafi'is, the Malikis, the Hanafis, because in those days, to get a new fatwa, they would bring all of the qudat of the various madhahib. And there was a debate in 917 AH. There was a debate that lasted for the better part of the day, some say even 2 days, where they went back and forth debating whether qahwa was halal or haram. And they brought forth witnesses, they brought forth expert testimony from doctors and from people who had confessed to drinking it. And it appears that eventually the ulama decided that qahwa was an intoxicant. Qahwa was a muskir. And therefore they gave a fatwa that it was haram to drink and sell qahwa, and that anybody who was caught drinking qahwa should be lashed and beaten because he's drinking a muskir. And in fact, some beatings were carried out. And eventually in 950 AH, corresponding to 1544 CE, the Uthmani Sultan, the Uthmani Khalifa, he actually ratified this decree and he made it the official state position that qahwa is a muskir, it is haram, and then the fatwas began to pour, literally pour, that saying that qahwa was an impermissible drink. And we have so many fatwa in that era. Now remember, we're talking about 900, 1000, 1100 hijrah. So you're not going to find Ibn Taymiyyah talking about qahwa. You're not going to find Ibn Hajar. You're not going to find this is like after 950 hijrah, which is around 1200, 1250 CE. And so we have Shaykh Al-Azhar, Ahmad ibn Abd al-Haq al-Sumbati. There's a fatwa he was asked that, Shaykh, what do you say about this new drink called qahwa that is known to change people's temperaments, and it is associated with much evil, and it is associated with backbiting and bad company, and it is typically accompanied by lazy men gambling away. That's what qahwa was associated with. Lazy men doing nothing except wasting their time gambling and wasting their days with dice and whatnot. So what is your position about? Now, by the way, even when you read the question, you already see where the sheikh's going to go with this, right? So the shaykh gave a harsh fatwa saying that it is absolutely haram, and that all coffee houses, cafes, all coffee houses should be shut down, and that anybody who was discovered drinking qahwa or operating a coffee house should be jailed and lashed. And therefore, for the next few months, in Cairo, this is in Cairo, this is not in Mecca now, right? And this is, by the way, the pre-Najdi, Wahhabi, whatever takeover. This isn't this, we're talking about 1000 CE. This isn't some hardcore fanatic fundamentalist movement, somebody might say. No, these are the mainstream scholars. This was their position about qahwa. And so in Cairo, a number of people were jailed for drinking coffee and whipped and lashed for the punishment of a muskir. And at the time, the bulk of the Maliki and Shafi'i scholars agreed with this fatwa because they viewed qahwa as being a muskir. And in fact, a very famous scholar, Shaykh Shamsuddin al-Qattan, who is from Madinah, he said qahwa and hashish are the same thing. Qahwa and hashish are the same. Another very famous scholar, Muhammad ibn Mahmud al-Zaini, who died in the 10th Islamic century, 16th Gregorian century, he wrote a treatise, an entire booklet against qahwa. And Shaykh al-Islam Abu Saud al-Afandi, and Shaykh al-Islam Abu Saud is a very famous author, most people of knowledge know him. He actually wrote a very famous treatise about qahwa, and other people also wrote books about it, Risala fi Ahkam al-Qahwa, there's a book there. Also, it is said that Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, it is alleged that the famous al-Suyuti wrote a book, Al-Istifta al-Safwa fi Tasfiyat al-Qahwa. And some scholars even said qahwa isn't just haram, qahwa is a bid'ah. Now, where they get this from? Well, the fact of the matter is that when the Yemeni traders first brought it in from Ethiopia, the first group of religious people to adopt qahwa were the Sufi tariqas. And they adopted the qahwa in order to give them the energy to do their dhikr sessions late into the night. So they began drinking qahwa as a part of their rituals in order that they do their dhikr and they do what they needed to do. So a number of scholars therefore said that because this group is doing this with this instrument, with this beverage, therefore it is becoming a bid'ah. Now, please, I'm not saying that this was unanimous agreed. I'm just saying there was a trend. There were famous scholars. In fact, this was the official position. People were lashed and punished, but there were always dissenting opinions, obviously. There were others people who said it is not haram, but the official position in Mecca, in Ottoman lands, in Cairo, in the early part of the 9th, 10th century Islamic centuries, is that qahwa is a muskir. And this became the well-known position, so much so that Francis Bacon, one of the most famous intellectual thinkers of Europe of the 17th century, Francis Bacon, who's one of the founders of basically post-Renaissance thought, one of the most famous philosophers. Anybody who's taken a class on Western philosophy knows Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon writes in 1626 that the Turks, meaning the Muslims, the Turks consider coffee as something that excites and disturbs the mind, i.e. a muskir. The Turks consider coffee as something that alters the mind. But the fatwas might have said one thing, society did something else. The fatwa might have said it's haram, but the people were drinking coffee. And they continued to drink qahwa, sometimes secretly and mostly in public. And the tide slowly but surely began to shift in the 11th Hijri, 17th Gregorian centuries, when more and more people began drinking qahwa. And there are a number of stories that are found, Allah knows how true they are, but there are a number of stories found in our literature of that time where a scholar who considered qahwa to be halal invited a group of scholars who considered coffee to be haram. He invited them over to discuss some issue. And he secretly gave them qahwa in the room. And he didn't tell them what it was, because obviously none of them had, tasted qahwa. So he gave them coffee that night. And mashallah, tabarakallah, the discussion that resulted about some fiqhi point was the most exciting discussion they had ever had. And one of them remarked, and the hours flew by and it was middle of the night, because obviously they're drinking coffee. And one of them remarks, what was this drink you gave us? It really stimulated us to give this deep discussion. And so he told them, this was the qahwa that you guys made haram. Now these stories are found in our tradition, but the fact of the matter is that there was a time when coffee was indeed considered to be haram by the majority, and especially those who are a little bit more conservative. And when I say conservative, I'm not using this as a slur, as a demeaning thing. I'm just saying there are certain scholars, they don't like change. There are certain scholars, they like status quo. That's what I mean by conservative. But slowly but surely, a small group of scholars began writing, being more vocal, saying, what's wrong with coffee? Coffee is not haram. Coffee is not a muskir. And a very famous Hanbali scholar by the name of Zainuddin Abdul Qadir al-Jaziri, who died 1587 CE, he wrote a book, Umdat al-Safwa fi Hill al-Qahwa. And this is the crux of the matter in declaring qahwa to be permissible. Umdat al-Safwa fi Hill al-Qahwa. And he wrote a very famous book, and there are manuscripts found of this book still to this day around the Muslim world. And slowly but surely, the group of scholars that had considered coffee to be haram just dwindled away. And eventually, this fatwa is basically unknown except in the books of history, so that when I tell it to you, you find it strange. But 500 years ago, this was the standard position. Coffee houses began to spread in Muslim lands, and these became places of socialization, sometimes good socializations, most of the time bad socialization. But there was also a lot of good there. And coffee houses became the place where the elite, the intellectual, the social class, the movers and shakers went to discuss issues. And it was in coffee houses that Al-Hasan al-Banna began his Ikhwan al-Muslimin movement back in the 1910s and 1920s. The first place Hasan al-Banna targeted was not the mosques, because he realized the people coming to the mosques don't need to be taught to come there. Rather, we need to target a different class of people. So Hasan al-Banna began giving his mawa'id, his khutab, his durus. He began the very first alim, because back then coffee houses were places where, generally speaking, not the religious people. You know what I'm saying? Yani those that are more into, music and smoke. They would smoke the Shisha or the Hookah over there. The people that are not associated with religion. Hasan al-Banna made it a point to go to those places. And he began preaching his message there. And that was what attracted a different crowd to come to the early Ikhwan al-Muslimin. And these days, of course, people don't even realize that there was a huge controversy over coffee. But the fact of the matter is, the sad fact of the matter, but we need to benefit and learn, is that coffee wasn't the only thing that was made haram in the course of our ummah. The fact of the matter is that a lot of things were considered to be bizarre, strange, haram, bid'ah, against the tradition. And later on they became standard. And I've given a very detailed lecture about perhaps the most embarrassing or the worst case of this, and that is of the printing press. And I have it, this is online, you can listen to this online. You can just Google my name, Printing Press and Yasir Qadhi, and you'll find a lecture. Even this lecture, wallahi, is a summary. It's only 45 minutes, and wallahi, it deserves to be in 10 hours. But the fact of the matter is that one of the main reasons the Muslim world was held behind when Europe continued its ascent was that the printing press was banned. And there was a time when the Ottoman Sultan issued a decree that anybody caught with a printing press shall be executed for heresy. And anybody who owns a printed book shall be basically thrown into jail. And for 350 years, when Europe is printing, when Descartes is printing, when Galileo is printing, when Newton is printing, the only way you can get a copy of any book in the Arab world is to go and handwrite it yourself. Now, of course, the religious scholars had some very good reasons. Wallahi, they had good reasons. What were those reasons? Number one on this list, they said, if we just start printing Bukhari and Muslim, Jahils will buy the book and misunderstand and abuse it. So we need to protect the tradition through the classical ijazah system. You want Bukhari? Come and study and I'll teach it for you. So that when you get Bukhari, when you get Muslim, when you get any book of fiqh, you have ijazah automatically to teach it. Wallahi, as a student of knowledge, as a sheikh, I say this is a very solid position. But you know what? It was an unrealistic position. It had a good benefit, but it wasn't something that was taking into account the changes. And eventually, how long can you stop the world from the printing press? The first printing press that came into Muslim lands was imported by Napoleon Bonaparte. When he invades Egypt in 1791, he forces the Muslim world to have a printing press. And up until that point in time, no Muslims ever printed books in Arabic. You're not going to find a single Arabic book, a single Islamic book printed by Muslims. The first people to print the Quran are non-Muslims because they had the printing press. The printing of the Quran, you understand. The first people to print the Quran were non-Muslims. Full of errors, full of problems. Muslims did not print books until 1820s, 1830s. At a time when even the islands of Hawaii had a printing press. No Muslim land had a printing press. Why? One of the reasons being, number one reason, the scholars said it is haram. You cannot, it's going to open up the door for heresy. And we don't talk about these things too much because it is wallahi embarrassing. And that is why the bulk of us, dare I say almost everybody here, did not know that the printing press was considered haram. Most of you didn't know. In fact, I don't think any of you knew that coffee was considered haram. But it wasn't even the printing press and coffee. The list goes on and on and on throughout our history. Unfortunately, we have some really embarrassing examples. Wallahi, one of the most embarrassing examples, it is so embarrassing that I am embarrassed to mention it, much less give a talk about it. I don't think I'll ever give a talk about it because wallahi it is embarrassing. But I want you to know because I want the shock and awe factor. And you will understand why I'm telling you this in inshallah 10 minutes. Be patient at me. But I need you to understand that sometimes some fatwa have held us so much back that we don't even know what to do. And one of the most embarrassing was that when the anti-slavery movement began to spread in Muslim lands in the 1850s, 1890s, 1900s, sadly, some of our scholars stood in the way of anti-slavery movements. And they said it is haram to ban slavery. You cannot ban what Allah has made halal. And there were famous controversies and fatwa about slavery. And do you know that in some Muslim lands, let me just be frank here, in Saudi Arabia, do you know when slavery was banned? Who can tell me when slavery was banned in Saudi Arabia? I wish. 1962. You know, when I was a student in Madinah, one of my teachers told me, and this is what just shocked me because I thought he must be kidding. One of my teachers who was in his 50s, and this is in the mid-90s, one of my teachers said, I remember the slave market in Suq al-Ghamama. You know, there's a famous place in Medina called the Masjid al-Ghamama. He said, we had a souk over there. I remember, and this my teacher is around 50 years old. I remember as a child, slaves being sold in the Ghamama marketplace. In 1962, King Faisal banned slavery and he made it completely illegal to have slaves in Saudi Arabia. 1962 was when slavery was banned in this great Muslim land otherwise, right? But again, this is an embarrassing episode that our scholars did not understand. Islam does not need slavery. You can ban it and Islam is completely perfect. It's not going to harm any of the rules of the Sharia. And in my humble opinion, as a footnote, this is the beauty of our religion when it comes to this issue, that Allah Azza wa Jal had the mechanism. It's already there, that it's not something that is encouraged, it is discouraged, and all the mechanisms are there to get rid of it. And so when finally the world got rid of it, alhamdulillah, we too, I don't know of a single scholar today who is clamoring for the return of slavery. And why should they? So the point being that throughout history, there have been so many episodes. My own teachers in Madinah, they tell me that when the radio was first introduced in Saudi Arabia, and this isn't just in Saudi Arabia, in every Muslim land the same thing happened. When the radio was first introduced, pretty much all the scholars said this is haram. And they even said this is sihr, magic. Because how can you have this device and we hear somebody sitting in London, in Timbuktu, in Geneva, and we hear him, on this radio? This must be sihr. And my teachers tell me this, that their teachers told them that when the radio came to Saudi Arabia, they actually, some of them actually went to the transmission towers, they actually went underneath those transmission towers and read Quran, hoping to destroy the sihr of the radio waves. Hoping to destroy that, khalas, there's not going to be any more radio waves and we're going to destroy it. Now, King Abdul Aziz, who was a very forward-thinking person in many ways, what did King Abdul Aziz do? King Abdul Aziz basically called all of the scholars to a majlis, and he told the Saudi Arabian Radio Society that had just newly established, he said, recite the Quran on the radio. So for the first time, the scholars heard the radio, and they heard the Quran being recited on the radio, and they said, this cannot be sihr then, because if it's sihr then there cannot be Quran, and so they changed their mind about the radio. But guess what happened when TV was introduced? Much worse. In fact, just a side point here is one of my tangents here. When they introduced the television, it wasn't just reading Quran under the towers. In 1966, the first television tower and broadcasting station of Riyadh, the first television station, was stormed by fundamentalist fanatics, and they took it hostage, and they demanded that basically no more television be broadcast in Saudi Arabia. And again, just FYI, completely tangent here, but there was a member of the royal family, of the Al Saud family, in that tower. Along with the fundamentalist, he was a very religious, overzealous person, and he was killed. When King Faisal was alive at the time, he sent in the troops, and they basically got rid of these people, and some people were killed. This prince, his own nephew, was killed. The one who killed King Faisal was his younger brother. Somebody shot Faisal point blank range, that was his nephew. The one who shot King Faisal was the younger brother of the one who was killed in 1966, and so some say there was a motive of revenge. Now, I'm quoting you fatwas from 1700s, 1800s, 1920s, 1960s. Let's get controversial and let's get real. Let's get right to 2013. An example that affects and affected many of us to some extent. To some extent. And that is the MBC serial of Umar ibn al-Khattab. How many of you know what I'm talking about, the MBC serial Umar ibn al-Khattab? Looking at the audience, it's around 90-95% have raised your hand. The bulk of you have raised your hands. You know what I'm talking about. The MBC serial on Umar ibn al-Khattab. Umar ibn al-Khattab serial, it's a video, for those of you who don't know, MBC, which is one of the most popular Arab news stations, or satellite stations, and it is one of the earliest as well, and it has, I know this sounds so weird, it has somewhat of an Islamic tilt compared to others, relatively speaking, right? It's a little bit more Islamic than the others. I mean, you want to compare that with LBC or something, you know what I'm saying? So, little bit of stuff. So MBC with an M, MBC, they commissioned a 30-episode series on the life of Umar ibn al-Khattab, to be broadcast this last Ramadan that we just finished off a few months ago, last Ramadan. And they spent the largest amount of money ever spent in the history of television to make an Islamic serial. Never before was the amount of professionalism, the amount of care and the equipment and the sets and the actors, they put it in. And anybody who has seen any of these serials, you see the quality yourself. There is nothing compared to the quality of these serials. Now, when the news came to the Muslim world that MBC is doing a serial on Umar ibn al-Khattab, fatwa began to pour in from every single respected body, basically in the Sunni world. Al-Azhar, Deobandi, Salafis, every single group. The fatwas began pouring in. And amazingly, when the Sunni world can hardly be united over anything, it was as if all of the major bodies were united that the serial is haram, it is a bid'ah to watch, you cannot do this, and they listed a whole bunch of reasons. Wallahi, many of them, if not most, are legitimate. They're not just coming out of thin air. There's some basis why they are opposed to it. And they have some legitimate points. But just like when the printing press is introduced, wallahi, they're not thinking 2, 3, 5 steps ahead. They're just thinking of the here and now. Now, you know what hurt me the most? And I was opposed to those fatwa from day one. As soon as those fatwas started pouring in, I supported the serials, by the way. I supported this series. Now, you know what hurt me the most? The fact that so many large bodies said these serials are haram. This series is haram. You cannot watch it. You should not broadcast it. They all said this, and yet this series became what? The highest watched, #1 serial in the history of Arab television. Now, what does that show you about the disconnectedness of the masses with their own scholars? When the Deobandis, the Azharis, the Tablighis, the Salafis, the Kibar al-Ulama, Mauritanian scholars all over the world, they're telling the Ummah, don't watch the serial. And guess what? It's #1 on the charts. What does that show you about how connected our scholars are with the pulse of the Ummah? This is what hurt me the most. Not the fact that they said it's haram. I respect that opinion. That's a legitimate position to hold. But what does that show you when the status of the scholars becomes so trivial? MBC didn't even care. They didn't even blink an eyelid, and the masses couldn't care either what their own scholars have said. It became the #1 serial in the history of Arab television. Why? Because it is a great series. I've seen half of them. I haven't seen all of them. I've seen half of them. I can tell you, as an expert in seerah, as somebody who knows the classical tradition, wallahi, this is modern da'wah. This is what the people will be inspired by. This is the reality of spreading Islam forward. Does that mean it's 100% legit? No, there are problems. But these problems exist. And you know, one of the scholars that I admire, and I generally don't speak about scholars too much, and there is a reason about that, but one of the scholars that I genuinely admire overall, Shaykh Salman al-Awda. Shaykh Salman al-Awda, he was actually on the committee to overlook the script. And he read through the entire series. And wallahi, completely coincidentally, I'm preparing this lecture 3 days ago, and somebody emails me, Sheikh, did you see Shaykh Salman al-Awda article about the MBC series? I said, no, it just came out 2 days ago, literally 2 days ago. It just came out, brand new article. I swear by Allah, I'm writing my lecture, and I'm going to mention Shaykh Salman, and literally just 3 days ago, somebody emails me the link. And I looked it up, and yes, he has a whole article on his Islam Today webpage, and he basically justifies what he's done. Because he got into so much trouble from the other scholars for being on the board of this MBC series. And he said, and he has a beautiful article, and you should go and read it. He basically said, look, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, poetry was the way people were affected. And our Prophet ﷺ, he didn't embrace poetry, but he allowed Hassan, he encouraged the Sahaba to use poetry to defend Islam. And television, the media, is the modern equivalent of poetry. And the fact of the matter is, no matter how many fatwa you give, you are not going to eliminate the popularity of the soap operas and the dramas and the romance series that are being imported from Turkey and from North Korea, being broadcast on Arab satellite channels. The Arabs know what I'm talking about. The Pakistanis are like, what? Don't worry about it. Pakistanis have Bollywood. You have enough to worry about as it is. But the Arabs know what I'm talking about, right? You import all of these Turkish, anyway, let's not get into there. So the point being that no matter how many fatwa you have, you're not going to stop the masses from watching that which is purely haram, pure filth, romance, semi-nudity, music. Why not provide an alternative that is much, much, much cleaner? Not necessarily 100% clean, but something that when you watch it, your iman will go up. I swear by Allah, I am not embarrassed to admit that when I watched those MBC series, my iman was renewed. Now somebody's going to say, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. What happened to the Quran? What happened to dhikr? Ya akhi, subhanallah, I read the Quran every day, alhamdulillah, I do my dhikr, I do my salah. But is it wrong to point out that when you see something and the context and the text is taken straight from Ibn Ishaq, from Ibn Hisham, and you see it, wallahi, it has an impact on you. It has an impact. And the vision has more of an impact than the speech. And I enjoyed watching, my family enjoyed watching with my kids, my wife. We want to all watch it together as a family. This is the reality. Now, a scholar who says this is halal, immediately other scholars and the more conservative, mainstream conservative people, how dare you say television is halal? My dear brothers and sisters, let us say television is haram. Let us say movies is haram. How many amongst you have not watched The Dark Knight? Yeah, I know you're joking. You all people, of course you watched it, right? I remember when The Dark Knight came out, it was Ramadan, wasn't it? Right? Wallahi, Facebook was going crazy with, do we have enough iman to wait until Ramadan is over? That was the question of Ramadan. You know this as well as I do. And some people confessed, you know what, I had to go after iftar tonight, I had to go see it. And some people said, no, this is Ramadan, I'm going to wait till after Eid. The question of it not going didn't even come up. It's only a question of when do you want to see The Dark Knight? Now, and you know what, let's be frank here. Fatawa can be as they are. Now somebody says, are you saying it is halal? I'm saying, who cares what anybody says? Did anybody follow the fatawa that came from the scholars? So, one of the jobs of a real murabbi, an alim rabbani, an alim who understands the people, is not to live in a utopia, is not to live in a dreamland and give fatwa to some utopia that doesn't exist. One of the jobs of the alim is to sense the pulse of the people, to see what is better than status quo, not necessarily what is ideal. Of course, television is 99% haram. Of course, I am still opposed to music. To this day, despite all of your claims I've changed, I still think music is something that Allah and His Messenger do not approve of. I still say this. Wind and string instruments. As for deaf, not a problem. This is my position. But the reality is, my fatwa carries how much weight? Isn't it better that we provide an alternative that is maybe not 100% halal, but 90%? It's wholesome, it's healthy, it gives the people something to... Wallahi, how many Muslims had no idea of anything about Umar's life until they saw the serial? Isn't this the fact of the matter, right? And every criticism that the scholars gave to the serial, every one of them, it has a basis in the Sharia. They're not just inventing it, they're not just pulling it out of their hat, but the fact of the matter is, why am I telling you all of this? Am I wanting you to disrespect the ulama? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. I seek Allah's refuge from ever hinting at such a matter. Our Prophet ﷺ said, the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. Al-ulama warathatul anbiya. And I seek Allah's refuge from ever trying to make you disconnected from Islamic scholarship. But I do want to impress upon you one simple point. Our scholars are humans. Our scholars are not divine, they're not infallible, they are not Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Collectively, they take on the job of the messengers. But here's the key word, collectively. Not individually. And every single one of these examples I gave, from the printing press to coffee to MBC, yes, it is true that sometimes a majority said it is haram, but there was always a minority that said it is halal. There was never unanimous consensus that printing is haram, that coffee is haram, that MBC cereal is haram. There's always been a group that said, no, let's be realistic, it is halal. So my point here, and really this is the issue, that we here in America are grappling with 1,000,001 diverse issues. Not just television, not just the printing press and mocha coffee. We're dealing with issues that we're not going to find solutions for in our classical textbooks. We have problems of living as a minority in a secular humanistic democracy. We have problems trying to balance our iman and ummah responsibilities with the responsibilities of being an American in a nation state. This type of tension did not exist in classical Islam. What do we do when our government is helping people to kill our brethren? What do we do when they're supporting Israel? What do we do when they're doing so much wrong in the Muslim world? And yet we are tax-paying citizens. It's not an easy answer. It's not a black and white scenario. My point to you, I need to impress upon you, understand modern scholars are grappling with modern issues of a very different nature, of a nature that you cannot open up Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Kathir and Ibn Hajar and Al-Suyuti and find a simple cut and paste fatwa. And what has happened is that most mainstream movements have solidified their understanding of Islam and their point of reference to be a group of people that do not understand our situation and needs. So the Deobandis look up to India, Pakistan, the Salafis look up to Saudi Arabia, the Egyptians look up to Al-Azhar. Each group, كُلُّ حِزْبٍ بِمَا لَدَيْهِمْ فَرِحُونَ. Each group has a group they have appointed to be the point of reference. We will take our Islam from them. But the fact of the matter is that our Islam from them cannot be unconditional because they don't live our lives. They don't understand our situation and scenario. And the analogy I want to give you here is the analogy of, I'm going to give you basically a symbolism, an analogy that will help us understand what I'm trying to explain to you. Imagine you grew up in your father's house. Your mother and father now moved on from this world. You're living in your house that you inherited from your father, your grandfather. You're used to each and every room. You're used to the furniture, you're used to the lamps where they are, you're used to this room being the study, this room being the bedroom, this room being the living room, and all of this is something you are comfortable with. This house, with its architecture and furniture, represents Islam. You are comfortable with it because that is how you inherited the house. Now, suppose there are people, let's call them the neighborhood housing committee, the neighborhood housing association. They have some tension with you and your house. This is the Western world now. They have some tension with you and your house. And they want to implement new rules for the houses on their block. Some of these rules seem to be fair, and some of them seem to be unfair. Perhaps some people on this committee even want to destroy your house. The far right-wing parties, the racist parties, the Tea Party people. They want to destroy your house. We don't want you to have this house in America. Now, let us bring in another element. You have inherited the house from your father. There are people outside wanting to destroy the house. You have a young son who's now grown up in this house that you have made, but he isn't too comfortable with your arrangement. He's seen other people's houses. He's seen his neighbor's house, and he wants change. He wants to convert that storage room into a study room for himself, let's say. He wants to fine-tune the furniture. He doesn't like the lamp, it's old-fashioned. He wants to bring in a better bed. He wants this, he wants that. And you're worried if you keep on saying no to him, he'll simply become a teenager, get his own job, and leave the house. And leaving the house means leaving Islam here. Leaving the house means leaving Islam. And you have to reach some type of compromise where you still preserve your house, make sure your son, your children are still living with you, and still make sure that the neighborhood housing committee does not destroy your house beyond recognition. Now, what is all of this here that I'm coming to? My point is very simple. My dear brothers and sisters, we need to separate the foundation of the house from the utility of the house. We need to separate the structure from the furniture. Our problem is, most of us do not separate the furniture from the house. Suppose your teenager wants a new bed. Does that destroy the house? No. But when some Muslim scholar begins calling for reform, like changing a new bed, immediately he's accused. Oh, you want to destroy the house like those guys outside. And this is the problem that many of us, and in myself, I'm not going to shy away from this. Yes, I myself and others are having. That when we call for some change, immediately people say, oh, you guys, you want to destroy the house like the outside association does, right? And the problem is that these people have confused the blueprints, the architecture with the furniture. They've confused the foundations with where the lamp is. And there are so many examples. And again, just to be controversial, because that's who I am, Mr. Controversial is my name, but just to give you some realistic examples, there are some people, they get irritated at so many things, gender interactions, gender rules. There will be people that will say Al-Maghrib is too liberal because men and women are in the same hall. And our forefathers did not allow men and women in the same hall. There will be others that will say we are too conservative because we're separating here, but we wouldn't separate in an actual classroom auditorium in a campus. If I was studying in campus, you're studying in campus, you don't have segregation in the campus halls, do you? So they'll say, oh, you guys are having a double standard here. We just announced we have a new female instructor. Automatic, look at the comments on Facebook. Some people criticizing, some people praising, some people saying, why sisters only class? Some people saying, it's alhamdulillah, sisters only class. You can't please everybody. And the problem comes, we as scholars need to go back and understand what is the foundation of Islam and what is the furniture that we're allowed to change. The fact of the matter, there's a cliche, we were taught this, there's only one Islam, and that is the Islam of the Prophet ﷺ. My dear brothers and sisters, it sounds very nice, but the question is, what do you mean there's only one Islam? What do you mean? It's a cliche. It's a platonic, gratitude that doesn't actually have, a platonic platitude that doesn't have meaning. What do you mean when you say there's only one Islam? Islam, the Quran is one, we agree. Our Prophet is one, we agree. His Sunnah is one, we agree. But the fact of the matter, from the very beginning, there have been various interpretations, especially in fiqh. And simple examples to suffice the point. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told men and women how to dress. There's an awrah for men, there's an awrah for women. Wherever Islam went, the people took the blueprint, the design, and they cut the cloth according to their cultures. And that is why the hijabs of Malaysia have never been like the hijabs of Timbuktu. And the hijabs of East Africa have never been like the hijabs of Afghanistan. And the hijabs of Saudi Arabia have never been like the hijabs of Egypt. Islam allowed for this diversity. Yes, Islam is one. Allah says to women, do this. Allah says to men, wear that. But wherever Islam went, it allowed for a healthy interpretation according with the text of the Shariah. And there are so many examples to be given here. The way that I am dressed right now. There are people that will immediately disqualify me from being a scholar or talib al-ilm. You can't be a sheikh. Look at how you're dressed. It's against the sunnah. The sunnah is to dress in a kurta shalwar with a white turban. Forget the fact the Prophet never saw a kurta shalwar in his life. He never wore that type of turban that is worn. Ibn al-Qayyim says the sunnah of the Prophet is to dress in the clothings of his own people. Because our Prophet dressed like his fellow Arabs. So you want to follow the sunnah, you dress like your own culture. And this is our culture, and this is following the sunnah when we dress like this. This is my opinion. But some people have interpreted Islam the way that their forefathers. The lamp was in the hallway. If I say, let's move the lamp over here. Oh, no, you want to destroy the building. And this is the problem. That people are not separating the fundamentals of Islam from that which has allowed, where change is indeed allowed. And again, there are so many examples that can be given. It is my humble opinion. It's been my opinion for over 10 years, by the way. Again, a lot of people say I've changed and whatnot. The fact of the matter is, I know how much I have changed and how much I haven't changed. There were positions that I held for many years, but it's just awkward to say them in public because people are not accustomed to them. In my humble opinion, based as a specialist in Aqidah and theology, I do not have any problems with private personal celebrations, whether they're birthdays, whether they're anniversaries. In my humble opinion, the Sharia does not tell us anything. They're neither mustahab nor makruh. It's halal because the Sharia does not come and dictate personal celebrations. Now, when I come and say this, wallahi, I have been told, what next? Sharab is halal? So because I allow a husband and wife to celebrate an anniversary, so they say, what next? You're going to say sharab is halal? You see, this type of mentality is saying coffee is the same as, you see my coffee there? Coffee is the same as hashish. It's that mentality. So, my point to all of you, and why do I say all of this? Because wallahi, brothers and sisters, I have lived through a number of phases of my life. I am not yet an old man, even though yesterday I discovered my first white hair, la hawla wa quwwata illa billah. But I'm still, alhamdulillah, inshallah, relatively young, even though this white hair really freaked me out. But anyway, I hope you can't see it now. But anyway, my point is, I have gone through some phases in my life, yes. And 20 years ago, yes, I too believed, okay, we have to have this narrow black and white understanding of Islam. But experience teaches you what books does not teach you. Experience teaches you what books cannot teach you. Living with the society, seeing the pulse, seeing the reality of the ummah, you learn certain wisdoms that no book can ever teach you. And the job of the alim, of the sheikh, of the murabbi is to bring Islam to the level of the people, to make Islam something that is realistic, something that is livable, something that is doable. So I want to conclude by pointing out 5 rules that I advise you and myself to follow when it comes to these types of controversial issues. 5 simple rules. Number one, we need to educate ourselves about those things which never change, the absolutes, the foundation of the house. We're not allowed to change the foundation. We can't do that. the foundation, the building, the structure. Yes, indeed, our Lord has revealed that. And these are the rock solid foundations. Belief in Allah, belief in the Prophets, names and attributes of Allah, Qadr, the Quran being the uncreated speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of this is rock solid. We cannot and should not, can never alter this. But there are things that can be changed. And we need to separate that which is immobile, that which is solid, the structure, from the furniture, from the arrangements, from the utility. My father might have used this room as a storage. My son wants to make it into a study. No big deal. Okay, it's all right. The fact that my father used it as a storage doesn't mean that my son cannot use it as a study, right? And I need to understand, him changing it from a storage to a study is not destroying the house. Quite the contrary, it's saving my son from leaving the house. You understand this point here, right? So we analyze that which cannot change, that which is immobile, solid, from that which can change. Number two, the question arises, how do we know that which can never change? And again, that's a very detailed talk, and it is a scholarly talk as well. For us here in this room, let me just say, the easiest way to know this is when the scholarly body of the entire ummah agrees that something is haram. When the ulama collectively, please underline collectively, because we have already seen in every one of these examples, sometimes a vast majority said something is haram. Sometimes. But never, coffee in the printing press and television, never did all of the scholars say this is haram. There was always a dissenting opinion. So when the ummah agrees upon something, then we consider it to be haram. And this is one of the ways of finding out, ijma', basically the consensus. So this is the second point. Look at what the scholars have agreed upon. And again, let's be controversial here. So for example, one of the biggest controversies in our times is about same-sex relationships. This is a very, very difficult problem. People have been banned, people have lost their jobs, people have stopped traveling because of this issue. They might have said statements that were harsh or whatnot. We cannot change the fundamental point that we can never accept it to be morally permissible for two people of the same gender to have sexual relations. This is a fundamental. We agree upon this point. There's nothing that can change this fundamental. What can change? Our language of addressing the problem. Our language of addressing the problem can change. No doubt many of our du'at and clerics, they use a language that is so harsh, we don't even find it in the Quran. The Prophet Lut, what did he tell his people? أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ مَا سَبَقَكُمْ بِهَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ مِنَ الْعَالَمِينَ. Do you do something vulgar that nobody before you did? Wallahi, beautiful. He did not say, I can't even say it here because I'm worried they're going to quote me 10-second clip and then I'm going to be smeared in this manner. He didn't say what many of our other clerics say, and that gets them into trouble. You understand what I'm saying here? The language that he's using, this is vulgar, this is wrong, you shouldn't do this, nobody before you did this, why don't you marry women, why do you go to the same gender? Notice how he said it. And there's nothing wrong with us resurrecting the same language. We cannot compromise on the morality of this issue. But we can compromise on how we say it and our treatment. Now, have any of you thought that the Prophet Lut, wasn't he and his family the only righteous people in the village, right? You know this, right? Have you ever thought, how did the Prophet Lut go shopping? How did he buy his goods? Do you think that he was scowling and spitting in the faces of everybody there? I'm asking you this question. He's interacting with a group, we know who they are, correct? What do you think his own relationship would have been? Our Prophet ﷺ is living in Mecca. They're all pagans, they're idol worshippers. Have you ever thought that there is no doubt that he must have known and witnessed the fahisha going on in Mecca? Men and women doing tawaf naked around the Kaaba. You know this was the case, right? Have you ever thought that our Prophet ﷺ is living there when that's going on? Of course he knows it. He's lowering his gaze, but it's there in front of him. When you live in a society where there is a fahisha present, no doubt your language to deal with it, your attitude toward the people who do it, it will be affected. It will be affected. It will be affected. Why? Because there's a human element that comes into play. There's a human element that comes into play. We are living and interacting with people of a different nature, of a different persuasion, so we're allowed to be different in how we approach it. We cannot change the fundamental, right? And other things examples can be given as well. So the second point, as we said, look at ijma', look at the scholarly consensus. Another example, again I'm controversial here, the issue of women-led salah that is in mixed jama'ah. By and large, there is ijma' on this point. There is unanimous consensus that a woman cannot lead a mixed congregation salah. Okay, this is an evidence in our Sharia. Ijma', you know what ijma' means? It means all the scholars have agreed on this issue. When all the scholars agree, khalas, sami'na wa ata'na. So when there is ijma', we respect that ijma' because ijma' is a source of Sunni law. Ijma' is a source of Sunni law. This brings me to my third point. And there's 5 points. And then we're done, inshallah. The third point. Realize there's always going to be a group, sometimes small, of vocal, forward-thinking scholars. People who do have the scholarly credentials. People who have shown that they're not coming from outside the tradition. They are from within the tradition. But their verdicts might not be in harmony with the mainstream, with the conservative masses. And I gave you examples of the Embassy Omar serial. The bulk of the Sunni Ummah, the scholarship, said it is haram. The Sunni Ummah themselves couldn't care less and they watched it. But you had a group of, in my humble opinion, forward-thinking, realistic ulama who understood, no, this is something that needs to be done. So it is up to each one of you to choose the alim that you feel the most comfortable with. And the one that you can say on the Day of Judgment, oh Allah, I followed this person because I'm not an alim. And I considered him to be an alim. He told me it's halal or haram. And I followed him trusting his expertise. You have to find that scholar. For many of you, those scholars will be people of your persuasion, that's fine. The Salafis will look to the Salafis, the Deobandis will look to the Deobandis, Tablighis will look to... This is the reality. Birds of a feather flock together. And there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. This is the reality. But I'm saying there is always going to be a group that is a little bit more forward-thinking. Not as pigeonholed into one group and one firqa. Because, brothers and sisters, call yourself what you will, but wallahi, Islam transcends any one of these movements. And that is a fact. Islam transcends any one of these movements. Now, look to your scholar and follow that scholar, but you have to do that choosing. And this leads me to my fourth point, that in my humble opinion, this is my suggestion to you, choose a scholar who's living your life, in your land, in your culture and society. In my humble opinion, I feel very passionately about this. One of the biggest problems of all of these movements, and that has caused Islam to not spread as well as it should, was that we outsourced our fatwas to back home. For some of us it's Egypt, for others it's Pakistan, for a large group here it's Saudi Arabia, as if only those scholars are the ones who know our situation. But the fact of the matter is that those people, with all respect to them, they're great for their societies. They know their societies. But you cannot get a fatwa about living in a secular democracy from somebody who's never lived in a secular democracy. You cannot get a fatwa about how to interact with your homosexual neighbor when a person has never met a person who's a homosexual in his life. There has to be a human element, experience. Wisdom, most of it comes from life, not from books. Take this as a rule of thumb. Most wisdom comes from living and not from reading books. You see the reality of what you're saying and you say, no, that can't be right. So in my humble opinion, my advice to you, look local, find ulama, and there are ulama, alhamdulillah. There are scholars here in Detroit, there's so many alims. Go to people in other communities, but look to people who are living here. And I want to tell you one anecdote, one story. That there is a scholar who's becoming very famous, and I don't mind telling his name. His name is Shaykh Al-Fawzan. He's the nephew of the famous Al-Fawzan. And he lived in America for 5-6 years. And then he went back. And I met him in England once when I was visiting. And I told him this point, Shaykh, that you need to understand that we really do need to insource our fatawa and not outsource them. And he told me, yeah, Yasir, you're absolutely right. I lived in America for 6 years. And in those 6 years, I myself changed so many fatwa I used to give the first year compared to my 6th year when I was there. I said, Shaykh, this is you after having lived in America for 6 years. How about me having been born and raised here and hearing a fatwa and know this fatwa is ridiculous for my people? In 6 years, if you can change, and you are, mashallah, tabarakallah, such a great scholar, such a great alim, and he is, wallah, he's a great alim. In 6 years, living in the people, he realized, I can't give the same fatwa anymore. I said, Shaykh, how about us? We live in the land. We know our people. In my humble opinion, brothers and sisters, you should not log on to the internet and go for fatwa search engines in other lands. Go to your local community alims. Go to people that have studied and trained in Al-Azhar, in Madinah, in Timbuktu, in Jamia bin Nouriya, wherever they might be. But they're people of your own kith and kin. They're people of your land. Come over here. The example here is that you have your house and you call an interior decorator from the island of Waki Waki to come and, make your house look good. And this person is going to bring in some sand beach, some desert shells, some here and there. You're going to say, this is not the way I decorate my house, but you call the wrong interior decorator. Don't blame anybody but yourself. Bring in somebody who knows your culture, who knows your civilization. And it is well known, Ibn al-Qayyim and others, they say, half of giving the fatwa is to know the context of the fatwa you're giving. Half of the fiqh is to know the context of the fatwa. This is half of ilm. And the fact of the matter, when you outsource, they don't have the context. So this is the fourth point. Don't outsource to Bangalore or to Timbuktu or to Saudi Arabia. Find people who are understanding your own situation. And the final point, be tolerant of opinions that come from respected authorities, even if you don't agree with them. Once upon a time, you might have looked down upon mocha. Once upon a time, you would have said printing books is haram. Once upon a time, you would have said, another controversy I didn't mention, microphones in the masjid. The entire Muslim world, once upon a time, in the 50s and 60s, some of you might even remember your father is talking about this, right? When microphones were introduced in the masjids, pretty much everybody said haram, bid'ah was used. Bid'ah. And this isn't just some hardcore Salafi fanatics. These are the Deobandis, the Azharis. This is the mainstream ummah. Because they said, you must hear the human voice. You cannot hear the electronic voice. So microphones are a bid'ah. You tell me what masjid in the world doesn't have a microphone today? The very masjids where these fatwas were given, physically the same masjid, they're using microphones now. My point being that allow some spectrum of opinion, even if you don't agree. Even if you don't agree. If it's coming, now here's the point, if it's coming from a scholar, here is the key point. In America, we have too many do-it-yourself scholars. Searching online doesn't give you Sheikh Google status. Looking up something on Wikipedia doesn't make you Mufti Wikipedia. You cannot become a do-it-yourself alim. But there are people that have studied the tradition. Look at their credentials. Look at what they've done for the ummah. And if they have a track record of bringing khair and good to the ummah, and they have a track record of upholding the Shariah, even if you disagree with some of their points of view, respect them for who they are. I want to be very frank here. There is an alim that I disagree with on so many issues, but wallahi, as Allah is my witness, I consider this alim to be one of our fundamental marji's, one of our main people we look up to, and that is Shaykh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. I don't agree with much of what he says in terms of his modern fiqh, but wallahi, I admire the guy as a towering intellectual genius, as somebody who understands the Sharia and its applicability in modern times. He might not be on the same wavelength as me in certain issues, but as an alim, I don't think anybody can rival that type of scholarship. MashaAllah, tabarakallah, wa la nuzakki ala Allahi ahada. But I'm trying to give you a practical example that even if I disagree with him, I respect him immensely. And I want all of you to respect Islamic scholarship and realize Islam is above any one group, any one scholar. It's above Qaradawi, it's above Kibar al-Ulama, it's above Saudi Arabia, it's above anybody. And people have differed from the time of the Sahaba, and they will continue to differ. Your job, find the alim or the ulama you feel comfortable with and stick with that alim, and be tolerant of opinions that come from esteemed scholars. These are the 5 points I want to reiterate. Number 1, that we need to learn that which is changing and that which cannot change. Number 2, we follow ijma', the scholarly consensus. Number 3, always realize there's going to be a group of scholars that are a little bit more forward thinking, a little bit more controversial. Number 4, look locally. don't outsource back home. And number 5, be tolerant even if you don't agree. Even if you don't like the fatwa, be tolerant of it. Perhaps you don't like it today, tomorrow it will be the standard fatwa of the whole world. The final thought that I have is that in the end of the day, eventually the truth always prevails. In the end of the day, printing presses will become halal. In the end of the day, microphones will be used. In the end of the day, everything, radio, television, it will be done. And truth shall prevail and change will happen. And when that happens, then insha'Allah ta'ala, you can meekly and not mockingly, next time you go to Mecca, enjoy your milk-infused mocha, marked as having been exported from Al-Mukha and manifested from the coffee beans of Kafa, without the discomfort of the fatwa that used to forbid mocha in the city of Mecca. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.